Hi, my name's Alistair Somerville, and this is a pep talk for the Content Design Club. And the title is Humane Centered Design. I'm Alistair, and you can get hold of me either on the internet at acuity.design or on Blue Sky at acuity.design too. Now, I come out of accessible design, mostly in physical spaces like museums and cultural attractions, but I do also work in digital. I'm going to use an example from one project as the start of this talk and to use it to discuss why I changed my ideas about content design and why I use it as the basis for a talk about humane and human design. Now, it's a redesign of the Imperial War Museum that we start with, and it was a redesign where they rebuilt the whole building and installed in the basement a new World War One gallery. And I was called in a few months before they opened, after several years of building, to design some accessible material. And I was provided with all of the design documentation and also did a site visit. And what is important to understand at the start is museums use narrative exhibition design a lot nowadays. There's a story that links all the elements and artifacts together in the exhibit. Previously, it was here is a period, here is a pile of artifacts and pictures, and you just wander around and sort it out yourself. Narrative design means there is a specific direction, there is a specific storyline, and you should follow it. So what they requested was a tactile map of the place, and literally in the mapping of the design there was just a rectangle which was a tactile object. What they meant was they were looking for a map which would allow blind and visually impaired people to be able to understand where they were and where they were going. And that's relatively standard. However, having seen the narrative exhibit design documentation and having visited the space, I realized that this was never going to be enough. So I delivered something else. What I delivered was a tactile map of the bounded narrative place and also where the quiet spaces were. And I'm going to explain what and why. So this is the map. This is the actual installed map in the Imperial War Museum in London. Just as one slight side point, the key is to the right rather than the left of the map, which is unusual for us. Standardly, we would go left to right because in general, that's how people, particularly in the West, read and take in information. However, the map, which was placed physically in quite a tight space in the museum, would mean that people encounter it from the side, from the right hand side, and therefore we put the key there because that was the direction in which they were traveling physically. And given the space and given the issues of being jogged, etc., it was felt better to put the design there so as to read that direction rather than where we normally do. However, let us look at the map in more detail. Here's the map. I've stripped out the braille because that makes no sense in a online presentation. What you're looking at is the space. It's an underground space, low ceilinged, concrete walls. You come in from one direction and you leave from the other. You do not have any alternative exits. You only have one pathway through the whole exhibit. So you come in, if you're looking at the C-shaped direction, you come in at the bottom of the C, you go round and up, and you come out at the top. That's the direction. That's the story. And that's a problem. So the first idea which we had to put into this was creating gaps for the narrative. We had to break the story into parts so that it was comprehensible. So there you have the 4 different sections: before, the beginning, the home front, and the impact of the war. This is a way of trying to create a sense of chapters, of content design, of this is a cognitive map, this is a content design map of what you will encounter, and therefore enabling you to sort the information into the correct areas. If it was just one huge book with no chapters, with no endings, no gaps, it would be too much. People seek bounded spaces. They need bounded spaces to be able to place information, whether it be in a map, whether it be in a story. So that was the first thing. The second thing is a map of sensory gaps. If you look at this, we also show where the seating areas are. Now, seating areas and seats matter in museums. I have, in fact, campaigned on the basis of sofas matter. People need to find somewhere to sit down. However, what this map shows is not what I would generally do. This is not all seating areas. The seating areas we show on the diagram are the seating areas which are nowhere near any content. They're quiet places. Again, low ceilinged, hard walled, massive numbers of audio-visual exhibits. What needed to be shown was where to be able to find yourself, to find quietness, to recover from the content. A gap in which a person can recover themselves and be able to survive all the content that has been thrown at them. And that's what that shows. How to escape as an individual, as a family, as a group, from all of the content which other people have decided that they think that you should have to pass through. So it's a map of gaps. The gaps of narrative and gaps from narrative. And gaps are humane design. Gaps are kindness, allowing people to find themselves, allowing people to have agency and autonomy. One of the issues I have in general is that there's a systematic bias to blocks, big blocks of information, and these are then bound together by presentation standards. And I don't find this helpful because it holds control towards the designer, towards the corporation, towards who is offering rather than reading. And so humane design needs to crack the blocks in order to create gaps, because the gaps matter. And so I often, when talking about accessibility, talk about chunking as being one of the critical pieces of content design for accessibility, because chunking is a way of actually creating breaks. I do have to say, however, that I really, really loathe the word chunking, because it's just unpleasant to read and to say. However, it is a good concept. The chunks enable gaps, and gaps matter. And I'm going to talk about 3 forms of gaps which matter to me. First of all, gaps for cognition and storytelling. During the COVID period, I ran a number of online workshops which used workshop content, which was delivered on greeting cards. There is the content on the greeting card on the outside, but inside there was this cognitive map. This is a map of a way of thinking about what information matters. And it's based upon the neuroscientist Professor Lisa Feldman Barrett's ideas of cognition in her book 7.5 Lessons About the Brain. What it looks at is the fact that we move through processes of storytelling and sensing and cognition to be able to understand what matters and what we think about things. So we have loose and diverse, which is perception. Many things being sensed, seen, tasted, smelt, whatever. We encounter a large amount of stuff, and it just is a large unsorted bucket of the things we encounter, because we're embodied, we're alive, we're conscious. However, the cognitive systems then start trying to find meaning in it. And this goes to the idea of stories and summaries. The way in which we understand things, what we sense, what we perceive, what we're told, is by making them into stories which we tell to ourselves to make sense. And those stories, those packages of content, those narratives we tell ourselves, become the packages which we then use in cognition, because then they are then sorted alongside those older stories, our memories, and those new stories, our anticipations, into some form of ability to be able to make decisions and choices. So the way in which you use gaps, the way in which gaps matter, is that these different ways in which we think and ways in which we tell stories are the way in which we can match content to cognition. Secondly, alternative formats and new voices. This comes out of a accessibility project for a number of museums in Germany. What this slide, which was from one of the early discussions, what the slide is talking about is the fact that accessibility is the doorway, bottom left-hand corner. You use accessibility to actually get people into the space, into the museum, being able to actually perceive the collection and what you're trying to say about the collection. And over time, you can provide more content, more metaphors, so more ways of talking about a thing, and more mediums, more technologies, more books, magazines, interpretation panels, however you think about it, in order to involve and create more stories for more people. However, a lot of organizations then stop at the red line, because the red line is the line at which they feel they're comfortable about how they can tell the story about their artifacts. However, what you need to do is break the barrier, crack through, because then you allow other people, the visitors, to be able to tell their stories, find their meanings, create new metaphors from their perspective, and create art and interpretation using their mediums. And this creates a more diverse and more divergent space of exploration. So the gaps are actually holding space for other people to tell their stories from their perspectives and using their capacity to make meaning in a way that you do not have. This is the crucial point about diversity. Diversity is the solution to some of the problems of trying to explain very difficult subjects to people who you do not know and have not yet encountered. Finally, humane information spaces. And this comes to the idea of being receptive, the idea that being kind to people is a good idea. This is a few leaflets, tactile leaflets from an English heritage project for a Roman fort in Housesteads. What this was, and this was a very fast project with only about a turnaround time, about a couple of weeks or more, about interpreting an artwork which was a new version of one of the Roman forts. And what we tried to say and what we tried to show was one leaflet was not enough, because one leaflet only defines things from your perspective of what you think people should know. But what we wanted to try and say was, well, visitors arrive with many different intentions, and these are just three of the possible ones which we could meet very quickly. Sometimes people just want the facts, a one piece, one page, simple description, so that they can encounter it and move very quickly to the actual physical space. Other people want more facts. They want to actually know as much as possible before they encounter it or as they go around it. So, more facts, please. And finally, some people want something which is just different. They can encounter the place as they wish, but what they would like is some novel alternative experience. So that was a diagram showing what the physical panels of the space were. All of this is about trying to say, try and meet people with their intent and create different content for different intents. This is a Lego map. It's diorama basically of Bedsley Hall, which is in the northeast, and the coloured blocks are all interpretation panels. This is a map of the positioning of the external interpretation system of Bedsley Hall. And what this was created for was not merely the fact that personally I find physicalization of information much easier to understand, but also we needed to understand how external interpretation works as a way of thinking about what information should be where and what information is important for. Because a lot of the time, the way in which people think about interpretation panels is they think that the encounter with the interpretation panel is what matters. However, there is also a viewpoint that actually it's the moments after the interpretation panel is read that matter. The way in which the group of people talk to each other, the stories they tell, the reactions, the content that they create is what matters. Again, this goes back to the German theory. We need to be able to support the storytelling and the content creation of people rather than thinking that it's all about our content and our intentions. So one of the things which came out of this was not adding more interpretation panels, leaving gaps so that people can move around the external spaces and take the spaces in as they wish. The more information you place in a space, the more you demand of people. Again, go back to the World War I gallery. We need to create gaps so that people can find their own time, find their own space, find their own self in a place and in the content. Sometimes the best content is no content. Humane-centered content design, therefore, is holding space for people. People to be able to have a sense of their own agency, their autonomy, and their comfort. Humane because it is kind. It doesn't force itself upon people. It doesn't demand stuff from people. And yet, artificial intelligence, I don't want to talk about it, but I think it's important to talk about it. So we have all of these AI summaries showing these blocks, again, of information. And again, it's the fact that institutions, corporations, systems have a bias to blocks. So previously we had the systemic bias to blocks held by standards. Now we have the systemic bias to data sets held by algorithms. Same bias, different names. Blocks never went away. They're always here. But within this, and I think this is the thing which I find important, there is a weakness. And the weakness of AIs is made explicit in the prompts that they require. There was an article on Wired just a few weeks ago called The Real Demon Inside ChatGPT, which is quite helpful. What's within it is the fact that the prompts show the problem of AI in the current period. The AI are untethered from reality. They don't have bodies, they don't have any actual fixed point of being. And being untethered means they have no capacity to have a perspective or context, and they need human beings. So the content of the prompt is what we as humans lend to the AI. As with a lot of technologies nowadays, there is a lot of borrowing by technologies in order to be able to then reflect it back to us as though the technology is more intelligent than us. And yet it is what we lend that creates that effect. What we lend AI is context, i.e., this is a specific perspective upon a specific problem. Ethics, that there is something which is wrong, there is something that is right. And emotion, that there are things which are happy and sad. These are things we lend AI because it does not know and cannot ever know. And thus, there is a gap in all of the AI systems, and the gap is between the data sets and the algorithms, and the gap is humans. And so gaps are human design. What is between the data sets and between the algorithms is humanity. Human-centered content design holds space for humanity. The systems cannot work without us. We are essential because they fail. And thus we need to keep making cracks in the big blocks. The content, the datasets need to keep being broken apart. We keep finding meaning in the gaps, the ethics, the emotions, the context. And to end off, what this means is in any form of content design, we need to value being human. Having context, having perspective, having ethics, having emotions, having agency. And we should be kind, both to ourselves and to the people we create content for. And thus, I would end with the fact that the value of content design, the value of the work done is you, and you should always value yourself. Thank you.